Hello, everyone. Today I have the amazing story for this the history of America. Long before any European ship touched the shores of the Americas, the continent was home to hundreds of distinct nations and cultures. Indigenous peoples had lived across North America for thousands of years, developing complex societies with their own languages, religions, systems of agriculture, and trade networks. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built multi-story dwellings into cliffs. In the Mississippi River Valley, the Mississippian culture constructed massive earthen mounds and maintained cities that, in some cases, rivaled European towns in population. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, developed a sophisticated system of governance that later influenced ideas about federalism among the founders of the United States. Across the Great Plains, the Southeast, and the Pacific Northwest, other nations thrived according to the resources and geography around them. These were not simple or static societies. They were dynamic civilizations that had adapted to their environments over countless generations, and they would soon face a catastrophic disruption from across the ocean: contact and colonization. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, sailing under the Spanish crown while searching for a western route to Asia, opened a new and devastating chapter for the peoples of the Americas. Columbus never set foot on the North American mainland, landing instead in the Caribbean, but his voyages set off a wave of European exploration and conquest. Spanish conquistadors such as Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vasquez de Coronado pushed into what is now the southern and southwestern United States in the following decades, bringing with them horses, steel weapons, and diseases like smallpox, to which native populations had no immunity. The demographic collapse that followed contact was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within the first century or so after European arrival, largely due to disease rather than direct violence, though violence, enslavement, and displacement compounded the tragedy. English colonization of North America began in earnest in the early 17th century. The Jamestown settlement, founded in 1607 in present-day Virginia, became the first permanent English colony, though its early years were marked by starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. Jamestown eventually found economic footing through the cultivation of tobacco, a crop that would shape the labor system of the American South for the next 2.5 centuries. In 1619, the same year the Virginia colony established a representative assembly called the House of Burgesses, the first recorded Africans were brought to Virginia, marking the beginning of a slave trade that would eventually bring hundreds of thousands of enslaved people to British North America and profoundly shape the nation's economy, politics, and social fabric for generations. Further north, in 1620, a group of English separatists seeking religious freedom, later remembered as the Pilgrims, landed at Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts aboard the Mayflower. Before disembarking, the passengers signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to govern themselves by majority rule, which is often cited as an early example of self-governance in the colonies. The Massachusetts Bay Colony followed in 1630, founded by Puritans who envisioned their settlement as a model Christian community, famously described by leader John Winthrop as a city upon a hill. Over the following decades, additional colonies were established along the Atlantic seaboard, each with its own character. Maryland as a haven for Catholics, Pennsylvania, founded by the Quaker William Penn, on principles of religious tolerance, and the Carolinas and Georgia developing plantation economies dependent on enslaved labor. By the early 18th century, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, each with its own government but united by common ties to the British Crown, and increasingly by shared economic and political interests that would eventually put them at odds with that same crown. The road to revolution tensions between the American colonies and Great Britain began to intensify after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. This conflict, part of the larger global struggle known as the 7 Years' War, had been enormously expensive for Britain, and the British government looked to the colonies to help pay down the resulting debt. A series of taxes and regulations followed, including the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to pay for a stamp on printed materials, and the Townshend Acts, which taxed imported goods such as glass, paper, and tea. Colonists protested these measures under the banner of no taxation without representation, arguing that, as they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, that body had no right to tax them. Resistance grew increasingly organized and increasingly bold. The Boston Massacre in 1770, in which British soldiers killed 5 colonists during a confrontation, became a powerful piece of political propaganda for the Patriot cause. In 1773, colonists in Boston, protesting a tax on tea, boarded British ships and dumped their cargo into the harbor in an event that became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with a series of punitive measures the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which further galvanized colonial resistance and led to the convening of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. When fighting broke out between colonial militia and British troops at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts in April 1775, the American Revolutionary War had effectively begun, even though a formal declaration of independence was still more than a year away. The Second Continental Congress took on the task of managing the war effort and over time moved toward a formal break with Britain. On July 4, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson, which announced the 13 colonies' separation from Great Britain and laid out a philosophical justification rooted in Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and government by consent of the governed. And the war that followed was long and difficult, marked by early defeats for the Continental Army under George Washington, harsh winters such as the one endured at Valley Forge, and a gradual turning of the tide aided by the entry of France as an ally following the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. The war effectively concluded with the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, and the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized American independence, building a new nation. The newly independent states first attempted to govern themselves under the Articles of Confederation, a system that proved too weak to manage the young nation's finances, foreign relations, or internal disputes. In response, delegates gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for what became known as the Constitutional Convention, ostensibly to revise the Articles, but ultimately producing an entirely new framework of government. The resulting Constitution established a federal system with 3 branches, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial, designed to check and balance one another's power. The document was the product of significant compromise, including the Great Compromise, which balanced representation between large and small states through a bicameral legislature, and the deeply troubling 3/5 Compromise, which counted enslaved people as a fraction of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, embedding the institution of slavery into the foundational structure of the new republic. The Constitution was ratified in 1788 after a fierce debate between Federalists, who supported the stronger central government it created, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it would trample individual liberties and state sovereignty. To address these concerns, the first Congress under the new Constitution proposed a series of amendments, 10 of which were ratified in 1791 and became known as the Bill of Rights, guaranteeing protections such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, and protections against unreasonable searches and self-incrimination. George Washington was elected the first president of the United States and served 2 terms, establishing precedents that would shape the presidency for centuries, including the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. His successor, John Adams, presided over the nation's first contested transfer of power when he lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, a moment often cited as proof of the resilience of the young republic's democratic institutions. Seat marker expansion and division. The early 19th century was a period of dramatic territorial growth for the United States. In 1803, President Jefferson negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with France, acquiring a vast territory that roughly doubled the size of the country for around $15 million. The subsequent Lewis and Clark expedition explored this new territory and the lands beyond, gathering information about geography, natural resources, and the many indigenous nations who already inhabited the land. Throughout the following decades, the United States continued to expand westward, driven by a belief that would later be termed manifest destiny, the idea that American expansion across the continent was both justified and inevitable.